Welcome to the arena. My name is Greg Sindelar, and today I'm joined by my good friend and my colleague, actually, at America First Policy Institute, Chad Wolf. Chad, thank you for coming to Texas and joining us.
It's my pleasure. It's always great to be, as I say, back home. I grew up in Texas, so it's always good to come back to God's country.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about your story. The whole purpose of this is to get to know you a little bit. Obviously, people know you as Secretary of DHS, but there's so much more about you. You're not just that. You're not just, have the best hair in the business. Something man. I'm very jealous of.
There it is.
But tell us a little bit about, growing up and how you kind of started to get into this world.
Yeah. So I actually grew up in two places. First in Mississippi, and then family moved to just outside of Dallas in Plano. So I went to middle school and high school there, and eventually college.
Did you go to Plano East or Plano West?
Plano East, Pesh. Okay. It's not Plano West. No,
no, sorry.
Pesh.
Fighting words.
And it was interesting because in my family, there wasn't a lot of military service, either on my mother or father's side. It's just not something that the family had. But from an early age, I always took an interest in government. I always took an interest in some type of public service of some kind. And I just didn't know really what that meant growing up in high school. I think some people that go in the military, they know early. Yeah. Like that's what they wanted to do. For me, it was never that, but I was always interested in things like the Constitution and, federal government and laws and how a law becomes a bill, bill becomes a law and all the, crazy stuff that you get introduced to in high school. It's just like in high school, most people learn that and then they move to the next thing.
Yeah, that's right.
And the next thing.
You got stuck.
My interest didn't move on. It was just sort of like, I want to know more about that. And so, that's what led me to college. I studied history and political science, which is sort of a combination of both of those, and the historical aspect of what the federal government does. And then
that was at SMU, right?
That was at Southern Methodist, yeah. Right. So graduated there and moved to D.C. Without a job, without a place to stay, and had a stack of resumes in my truck because I'm from Texas. I got a truck.
Did you have to sleep in your truck at all?
No, I slept on a sofa for about 4 months.
Okay,
a friend,
there you go.
That was up there, handed out my resume, got a job answering phones.
Would your wife allow your kids to do that?
No, absolutely not. And I should tell you, my parents were like, okay, you've got great education, you got a diploma from SMU, which is not anything to sneeze at. Why are you answering phones in a congressional office in D.C.? Now, that was for Senator Phil Gramm, was a great
heroes,
American, great American. And so I was happy to do that. And a funny story, the senator took me aside and said, you're going to be learning so much here. You should really be paying me to work here.
That sounds like Phil.
Yeah. I mean, I was making like $18,000 a year. So I was like, I'm not sure I got enough to pay you as well.
Yeah, that's right.
And so that interest just continued to grow. President Bush came in 2000. 9/11 happened in September of 2001, which really changed my trajectory. I was working on Capitol Hill, heard the aircraft fly overhead, and saw how the country reacted to that. And so really had an impact on me. And really from that moment on, in September of 2001, my career has been dictated by the events of that day and to sort of moving Homeland Security in some respects in a more positive direction. So worked at DHS under President Bush, a variety of different things. Obviously did not work there under President Obama.
He didn't want to keep you
on? No. President Trump served all 4 years and supporting as I can now on the outside. So you got to, I get a lot of questions from young people who say, well, how do I do what you did, or how to do something similar? And so a couple of pieces of advice I give folks is work hard. Yeah. Work harder than all of your colleagues or your other 20-somethings. When they're going out to the happy hour, you work harder. Yeah. Right? Because that shows a commitment. You may not always get it right. You may not always be the smartest person, but it shows a commitment that I think pays off, and it breeds a certain work ethic to you. Surround yourself with good people. So the network that you build as you grow up and as you come to DC, if that's what you want to do, or wherever you go, make sure you're surrounding yourself with a good network of people, because whether you know it or not, eventually they will start trying to take care of you in certain ways. And so if you got a good network and they're good people, it's just good things are going to happen. If you surround yourself with not so good people that only care about themselves, well, that's not going to really benefit you at all.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good advice. I always tell people, just try to create value, and opportunities will come. And this is it's not just this business, but every business is a relationship business, and the people you know will they want to help, right? But you have to also know what kind of help you need, and so your network's really important. So obviously, in the first Trump admin, you ended as acting Secretary of DHS, but take us a little bit through the journey of how you got there, because it's really interesting. Because you worked on policy, you did a bunch of different things within DHS.
Yeah, and the beginning of this story, I'll start with another piece of advice I give to younger folks, that particularly if you go to DC or you're in this policy world, like, don't try to chart out your career, right? And saying after 2 years, I want to do this, 2 years, like, you never know where things are going to go. And my story, particularly at DHS, is a good illustration of that. So I came in 17. Well, let's back up, because I think the interesting part is in 17, the chief of staff of the department, the incoming chief of staff there with Secretary Kelly at the time, called me up and said, hey, I want you to come in. I had worked with her previously. In fact, I had hired her during the Bush administration.
Oh, wow.
Right? She then became chief of staff and was now hiring me. So it's also a very small world. But she said, we need you back in. I didn't want to go, was in the private sector, had small kids, a lot of different constraints there is the best way, but eventually did go in. But they said, look, of the 50 or so politicals coming into DHS, no one knows anything about aviation security but you. Now, we know that you worked there during President Bush and you probably want to do something different, but will you go down there? And I said, yeah, I'm happy to go down there. What I didn't ask them is, how long will I be there? What's my title? And what's my pay? I just said, yes, I'm happy to go there. Right. And I think that showed a willingness, like, okay, he's on the team. Right. He's not in it for himself. Now, in my back of my mind, it was sort of like, okay, I'm happy to do this. I don't want to make a career out of this because I want to do other things, but I'm happy to do that. So I was at TSA for about 6 months, brought up to the department to be deputy chief of staff, an acting chief of staff, eventually the chief of staff. And the question is, well, how did you do that? And I think the easiest answer, which is one I go back to, is just work hard. Get to know it. I didn't know a lot of the department, but I just got to know it. And you make good decisions. You've got a good moral compass. You can make some quality decisions, or put people in places that can make quality decisions, and good things happen. So chief of staff, then an assistant secretary, an undersecretary, and then an acting secretary. So as I like to say, I think I've had every job at the department.
I think you have, and that's also kind of shows a little bit of how term one was under President Trump, because there are, Republicans there are a lot of them that were very uneasy with him and the whole movement. And so if you were willing to seize opportunities, there's a lot of great things that you could do. So before we kind of move on to like what's happening now, I would love for you to talk a little bit about, what are the things you're most proud of in that service, and what's maybe one of the more let me ask this question. What was it like in some of those congressional testimonies you had to do?
Oh, it's tough, right? I mean, it's so funny because term one is very different than term two. Term one, as you indicated, we had a hard time fielding a team, fielding a good team of people that wanted to come serve. And even when you did come serve, so I'm thinking like, 2018, 19, and 20, I mean, you were just bombarded about how you were the worst person in human history. My house was protested. I was called all sorts of names, only for serving a president that was unusual. That didn't act like a normal president or a normal politician. If you fast forward to Trump 2.0, the second term, I mean, there's a waiting list of people that want to serve. And now it's kind of cool to serve in the Trump administration. So very, very different. And so at that time, I mean, I'm proud of a lot of what we did there, I think. And I give a lot of credit to President Trump, because he gave us the latitude and was willing to back us up to do things differently. He wasn't just saying, "No, let's make a couple of, a couple things that we can do around the edge of immigration. Let's attack it frontal and straight on," right? Which is a lot of what TPPF and AFPI talks about now, is like instrumental and fundamental change, because it's not enough just to play around with the edges. The system is broken, and you got to re-baseline it. And so I'm very proud about all of that. I would say 2020 was challenging for COVID, for civil unrest, for a variety of things that we were dealing with. So proud of that year as service. And then I'll tell you, for the 4 years of the Biden administration, I think the America First Policy Institute was on the forefront of really pushing back and saying, no. There's a better way to do this.
Yeah.
Don't believe what you're hearing, that we just have to accept everything that's happening along the border just because, well, that's just how it is.
Yep.
There's just migration flows and it's the pattern of life. No, that's not acceptable. And so really, really proud and excited about those 4 years and really what we continue to do at AFPI.
Yeah, well, and we could spend a whole segment just talking about the story of AFPI and what you are such a huge part in building there. But I think you touched on the really important thing is obviously the work that you led at AFPI that was informed by a lot of your experiences and your work in the first Trump admin has led now to the safest, most secure border we've had. You know, living in Texas, it was the number one issue in every county across the state. And now it's like issue 5, 6, 7. People are still worried about it. They're more worried about it with what do we do with all the people here and things of that nature. So can you take people through and help them understand how did the president, after all the gaslighting of the Biden years of we can't do anything about it, how did the president and the administration get control of our southern border so quickly?
Yeah, I talk about 3 things. 1 is political will, 2 is policy, and 3 is resources, right? And so what you didn't have with President Biden was political will to do anything, much less anything on immigration. And so President Trump, as you can tell, I mean, it's what he talks about. It's what he talked about leading into the election in 16, but certainly in 24 as well, right? Which is he's going to solve this. So he came in and there was political will and runway to do something different, which means an ushering in of different policies. And as I've said for a period of time, if you just allow Border Patrol and ICE to do their job and ask them what they need to do it better, do they need more resources or policy, they'll tell you.
Yeah.
Because they're the professionals. They know how to do it. And so it took someone like President Trump to listen to him and his team around him to listen to him and to do that. And they've done that effectively, you know, starting in January of 25. And so now you see a completely different border. We're not talking about thousands of folks coming across the border. We're not talking about Del Rio and all these different places along the border anymore. What we are talking about is removals. And I think the American people are saying, look, you got the border under control. I got it. But let's not forget about what President Biden did to this country. And 12 million or more people have come across that border. They don't have a legal right to be here. They should be removed from the country. And I think that's what the current administration is grappling with on a variety of different fronts, operationally, but also public policy messaging wise, right? They've kind of gotten behind the 8 ball here a little bit because every day that we're not talking about and touting the success that the Trump administration has, and we're talking about Minneapolis, or we're talking about defunding ICE, or we're talking about all this, it's a day lost because we've got about 3 more years here.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and I think the left tries to draw us off sides and into these other things, right? And in the, you know, in the first term, obviously a lot of the work you're doing in Border Patrol, they were, you know, the evil ones. Now it's really focused, since it's so much on what do we do with the people here? How do we remove them? Is really focused on ICE, and so. You know, you've seen, Tom Homan, our border czar, will be at this event later this week, and so I'm sure he'll talk a lot about this. But how do we go about addressing that issue, and how do we keep momentum behind it so that we don't kind of lose maybe a little bit of the plot or allow the left to take us down rabbit holes?
Well, I think the president has made a couple of course corrections. Obviously, we've got a new DHS secretary because I think his signal was, I don't like the direction that this immigration issue that he should be winning on because of all the success. It was somehow getting diluted, right? And so I talked about in the panel I just did that it's really important to have that political will and that policy, but if you can't talk about it the right way, and you can't communicate it the right way, then you got an issue, or you go too far one way and not the other. DHS is a law enforcement agency, and I think a lot of Americans, not all, but a lot of Americans are for law enforcement. They are pro law enforcement. They just don't want to see it every day, right? They just want to, like, you do your job over here, and I don't need to see people getting tackled. Now, some people like to see that, to be clear, but you do your job, do it in a smart and a professional way, and I'll support you. I'll continue to give you resources and authority to keep us safe. And I think the department would be well served, and I think they are doing that under the new secretary. Is we've got a mission to do here, and we're going to promote our wins, absolutely. But we're not going to make cartoonish memes and kind of go way far away from that law enforcement mentality.
Yeah. Well, law enforcement, special ops, things like that. Like people usually look at it as when I don't see it, but I see the effects of it, then it's working, right? And that's I think you're right. That's how most people want to experience that. Well, let's kind of go down a little bit more in the funnel and talk about what the states can be doing. Obviously, Texas has spent billions and billions of dollars. We've created our own Homeland Security office within DPS to start tackling this. We've had Operation Lone Star, but as we're coming up on the next session and starting to prepare for the next legislative session, it's a kind of a unique moment in time where we have a very friendly administration, a very friendly Secretary of DHS, borders are, et cetera. How can Texas and the legislature and the elected officials here go on offense to ensure that what did happen during the Biden years doesn't happen again if things change in D.C.?
Well, I think the one way I look at it is, the governor had to respond immediately to what the Biden administration wasn't doing, which was protecting Texans, right, and enforcing border security. So he had to dip into the budget, right? Had to throw a lot of things at the problem. Now I think you're in a position, the state is, to take a longer view of this, which then shifts to the legislature, right? To say, okay, what are the bills that we need to pass to put into state law, things that disincentivize folks coming to the state illegally, right? So if there is another Democratic administration in the White House who is not as pro-enforcement as President Trump, then that means that the cartels and others are going to say, okay, now's the opportunity. But you know what? We're not going to shuttle these people through Texas, right? Because the number of laws that they have passed that disincentivize people crossing there and then staying there are so comprehensive that, you know what? We're going to move people through Arizona. We're going to move people through Colorado. I'm not saying shift the problem to them, but look, this is Texas, right?
You'd rather probably deal with this in California if I'm them as opposed to Texas.
Let them deal with that,
right?
And so I think now is the time for the legislature to say, okay, how do we do this from, can we dive into some of these federal issues? And I think there's a little bit of a question mark, right? Yeah. Because like work permits, one incentive for folks to come to a place like Texas is that they get to work. They get to make money and they get to send that back home as a remittance, right? If you take away their ability to work, they've come into the country illegally. Why do we give them work permits? Now, that's largely a federal issue, but can the state play around the edges here that make it more difficult to do that? Or in the like. So I think there's a number of things that the state can look at to make, from education system to anything having to do with folks that are here illegally, making it more difficult for them to stay, to earn money, I think will disincentivize them coming illegally and will incentivize them to come legally, which is, I think, what we all want. Yeah.
And how do you get rid of some of those magnets? We look at the education system, healthcare system, all these things that are drained, by a lot of the strain of this.
And then one thing I would think about, which is a little bit harder, which we're all focused on illegal immigration right now, which is fine. I think the fight to come, though, is on the legal immigration side, because I think what the left is starting to do is to say, okay, wait a minute, they've got this figured out, and now we're going to start to figure out how do we utilize the legal immigration system, just as we did the illegal immigration system, to get our goals over the finish line. And so I don't want to sit here in 2 decades from now or in a decade from now saying, well, we wish we would have tackled the legal immigration issue, because look, folks can come in, they're not being properly vetted. There's a lot of bad things happening with people that are here legally, not just illegally. It's both. And I think we need to wake up to that.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right. I know in the first Trump admin, they looked at how they turn the system more merit-based and reduce the number of visas and make it actually understandable for what are the requirements for you to come in, which I would say, we want to make sure we get people who love this country, want to be a productive part of this country. And it shouldn't be at the we shouldn't be costing Americans like their ability to make a livelihood, right?
And who want to assimilate, who actually want to become Americans, not just come here, make money, send it back home, fly your foreign flag, not want to speak English. Like, how do you assimilate is really, really important. And I'll give you one stat. About 86% of people that come into the United States legally are no form of merit.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah.
That they're here because their family members here, chain migration, whatever it might be. We need
the diversity lottery, which is like the most wild.
We need people here that the United States says this is the type of legal immigrant that we need today.
Yep.
Because of the economy, because of what we want to do, let's bring them in if we want to, right? That's not the way the system is designed today.
Yeah. Well, and the fact that so many of them end up on entitlement programs and other things like this is just clearly not working. I think you're 100% right. So if you have a crystal ball, you look into the future. What gives you hope that we will actually get our arms around this problem, which Chip Roy as well as I did, but when we first started this work at TPPF, he said, Greg, this is harder, like 1,000 times harder than any of the healthcare work you're doing. He's like, this is a really, really difficult issue.
Yeah, it is. I think what gives me hope here is that President Trump, I think, has changed the baseline as we look at immigration and illegal immigration. Not legal just yet. Hopefully we'll get there in the next 3 years. I think he's changed the baseline, and I think there are some on the left, the responsible ones on the left, that say, you know what happened during President Biden's tenure probably wasn't good for anyone.
Yeah.
Now, you're still going to have the far left that loved it. And so I think the baseline of how we look at border security, I could be wrong, I hope I'm not, has fundamentally changed, where people say, it's probably a good thing we didn't have 20,000 coming across the border in a given week.
Yeah.
And now it's how do we continue to improve? I think the challenge that this administration has right now, just like the first administration, they were judged rightly or wrongly on how many miles of the border wall they built.
Yeah.
Was the president successful? I think this term will be figuring out this deportation and the removal process.
Yeah.
And is it, some people will say, well, it all depends on how many people you remove, the numbers.
Yeah.
Or, so is it quantity over quality, or is it quality over quantity, or is it somewhere in the middle?
Yeah.
And so I think that's what Secretary Mullen and the White House, that's the challenge before them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, last question. Earlier today at lunch, we had Senator Tellez from Mexico speak, and she talked a lot about the corruption, the narco terrorists, et cetera, and the issues emanating from Mexico. The reauthorization of the USMCA is coming up. Obviously, it's a big deal when it comes to trade, and there's been talks about linking security with that. How do you see that playing out? What are the things that, as a state, Texas should be looking at, federally should be looking at, to ensure that Mexico remains a good partner in all of this?
Yeah, look, I think that's some leverage, the USMCA renegotiation. I think that's leverage that the U.S. has. I think they have other leverage. I think President Trump can do a variety of different things. He's tackling so much right now, right? And I have to say
so much that we often forget about many of the things. So just
I have to say, coming in, I would have said, his relationship with President Sheinbaum in Mexico, it's not going to be good. It's just not. They're totally different. I was wrong.
Yeah.
Like, it seems to be like one of the people he gets along well with. Now, at the same time, I think he wants to see more from them. So I think the question on the table is, what are the pressure points that you can put on the government of Mexico to do more? Now, they've done a lot. I'm not going to say they haven't. In their system of government, they've done a lot, but we need them to do more. Yeah. So we need them to either accept more resources and more help, whatever that may look like, knowing that they've got political constraints. But I think I think the Trump administration, it doesn't have to be publicly, it can be privately, has got to push them into doing things that they're a little uncomfortable doing, but they can do.
Yeah.
And I think if they do that, then you're going to continue to see improvements. But the number one issue are the cartels. Yeah. Right. And that's what the president talks about. And I think for the American people to believe in that America First approach and the attention that he has placed on the cartels, which is the right attention, I think something fundamentally is going to have to change in the next 3 years with the cartels. Because if we continue just to be like, they're a problem,
Yeah.
American people are going to be like, yeah, I know they're a problem.
We're unwilling to do anything about it. There's
right.
incursions into Texas.
Right.
But some of the great work that you did, some of our friends at TPF, colleagues at TPF did on designating them as foreign terrorist organizations, huge in unlocking more resources. But I think you're right. Until Mexico actually wants to tackle the issue related to corruption that comes from the cartels, it's going to be really, really difficult. Well, Chad, it's always a pleasure to see you here in Texas. I'm sure I'll see you in DC next week when I'm there. But I appreciate all your leadership and your thought leadership on these issues. And it's always a pleasure visiting, man.
All right. Good to be here.
All right.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you all for listening to this episode of The Arena. We'll be back with a new episode soon.